It's wonderful to be here. My time at Syracuse was intense. I learned so much, and as I'm sure you're well aware, or maybe you don't fully realize as graduate students, you are creating a community of scholars and friends that you will return to again and again over the course of your very long careers. And so I began this talk with the chore and joy of reflection. And one of the first things I discovered was that I didn't take many pictures in the 1980s at Syracuse. And when you think about it, we were graduate students on a budget. Film was expensive, and you shot wisely. We didn't have cell phones. So I went back through the archives, and I didn't find much, but I found a few things. They'll be sprinkled throughout the talk. But my home was H.B. Krause, and the geography department was up on the second floor, and we were all clustered together. We weren't distributed throughout the building. And then the graduate students, as is always the case, were given the interior spaces with no windows, 4 and 5 desks, and but we were always easily found, and did our various projects and assisting in courses and grading and research assistance. And I noticed I have pictures of Syracuse in the sunshine, because that was usually a very exciting moment, and that's what I took pictures of. But this is the mall, or the quad, probably not that different, maybe a few more buildings, bicycles. And then I remember being told this. I never knew George Cressy, but this is the Cressy home, which is near, you would know this, Don. And what's distinguished about it, it had shutters with Chinese characters. I don't even know if this is still standing. It is? All right. So there are, geographers are capable of leaving their marks on the landscape, and that's one example. So thought as going back, my model here is my husband, Rob Crandall, who happily came to me, well, maybe not happily, but he came with me to Syracuse and worked for the Syracuse newspapers. And this is our office. And you might not recognize this thing. This is a telephone. I don't know if they have them. I felt very excited. It was a red, like a hotline. In the background, there's a Rolodex. That was very state-of-the-art. I don't know if people have those anymore. And this was our pride and joy, the K-Pro, a luggable computer, pretty primitive. I also had a typewriter in the room, because in the 1980s, a lot of us had typewriters. That was state-of-the-art. You had floppy disks you had to move in and out, and it didn't even do spell check. You had to put in other disks. Not a lot of graphics, little teeny green letters, but that was high tech. And then a few other smatterings, an Irwin Rice map of the United States. Again, what wonderful cartographic representation of the US, at least its physical geography. And some of the things I've noted, there was no Googling it, which is second nature to all of us now. We spent a lot of time in the library. We looked up articles, and there were microfiche, and you had to, you copied wisely because it was expensive. We drew maps by hand in Mark's class. Pen and ink cartography, we could use Zipatone sometime. Computer-drawn maps were just starting to become used. We didn't teach that yet. And then they weren't very attractive. They've gotten much, much better. The other thing hasn't changed, I'm sure. Winters were cold and long. And the basketball team did really well when I was a student here. We made it to the Final Four in 1987 and lost. And just to know that funding is, I started out with a GPOP stipend. It was a federal grant. It was for minorities. I'm a minority. Because there weren't many women in geography, and that's what made me eligible for the GPOP. $430 a month. It was even hard then to live on $430 a month, but I had a 2-bedroom apartment for $200, and my husband paid half and I paid half, so it was about 25% of my income went to rent. And then things got really good. A few years later, I got a Department of Education grant, which was later called the Jacob Javits Grant. And that gave me 4 years of funding, $10,000 a year. I was living well. And then I moved to Venezuela, and $10,000 in Venezuela meant I even had a housekeeper. She could come and clean my house once a week. So I got spoiled under that arrangement. And with enough money to finish my, to be able to write for a year and not have to worry about teaching. And so that certainly helped me move through the program. David prepared this graphic and sent it to me. And it lists what I did as I blocked out the years I was here, taking courses from 84 to 87. Then I came back in the fall of 89 and taught a course and was finishing up my dissertation. And what I did is block out sort of the range of professors from Stuart Corbridge to Marwin Samuelson, Jim Duncan, John Western. There was, Mark was here, David Robinson, John Agnew, John Mercer, Jim Newman, Don Monig, Dave DeLovenfels. So one of the striking things, it was an all-male faculty with a lot of guys named John. John Mercer, John Western, John Agnew, John Reese. So if you just said John, you were bound to get someone's attention. Although, and there was a lot of camaraderie, faculty and students. But let me tell you about my cohort. Most of us who stayed on and got PhDs ended up getting academic jobs. Not all of us, but we certainly benefited from the training that we received from Syracuse. And at that time, it was a really hard-working, hard-playing cohort of students. We worked hard. Seminars, I remember being really somewhat competitive. There was sometimes one-upsmanship, but then it all would be smoothed over with late-night sessions drinking beer and meditating over who was right about particular points. Most of the people lived off of Euclid Avenue and the Westcott Corridor, although I was a deviant from that pattern and ended up moving to Phoenix, New York, which is a topic I'll get to in a minute. The Department of Geography was very highly ranked and especially known for cultural historical geography and political geography. We were not especially well known for techniques and nor physical geography, which is a pattern I think that still has a legacy here, although I know there's more physical geography now. There were more men than women in terms of the graduate student, and about a third were international, and that was something that started to change in the mid-'80s, so that I had colleagues from Korea, from South Africa, from Ireland, Britain, Scotland, not one Chinese student at the time. And having that international flavor to the department was really significant and certainly allowed us to talk about geography from many different vantage points. I didn't feel that I could fully cover the full breadth of the 80s, and so I reached out to 8 colleagues that were here in the 80s, and I sent them some questions and asked for their insights. And so throughout the talk, I'll be sharing their comments and observations, though to chase to the conclusion, all of us agreed that we got a tremendous amount from our training at Syracuse. Now, I learned from David Robinson that you need data and numbers, and actually I pilfered this from a Syracuse report, alumni brochure that was made in 1991, but it kind of captures, these were graduate degrees granted more or less in the 80s. So I came in this year, I got my first degree here, and most of my cohort probably got their degrees in this period, and you can see there's actually quite a few international students. the breakdown male and female, a little more male than female for sure, and then PhDs and MAs. Since I actually didn't get my degree, PhD, until technically 91, I'm not in that PhD category. But numbers only tell you so much. Here's a few images from the past. This is a gathering at my home. I lived up in Phoenix, New York, and you know, there wasn't much to do, but there was bowling. So we had a bowling party, not in my house, but nearby. Pool was also involved. You know, there were these rural bars, and you could play pool, you could go bowling. There weren't even coffee shops back then. There was no Starbucks. You know, there were limited opportunities. And the other thing in terms of lasting friendships, Maureen Hayes Mitchell, the bottom, but we're still very close friends. She teaches at Colgate University in geography. And Deborah Hart, we were colleagues together here. We were colleagues together at GW for a few years. Then she went on to work and live in South Africa for 20 years. And now she's back in Washington teaching at a charter school to geography to almost all African American students. And she's a neighbor of mine. So that's a recent picture. So imagine yourselves 30 years from now and maybe still getting together with some. So one of the things I've always said about Syracuse, it's a great place to be a student. You know, what else are you going to do? The winters were long. And to preface this, I was born and raised in Southern California. I did not own wool before I came to Syracuse. Of course, people don't use wool anymore, but at that time they did. And I didn't really understand what winter could be. And this is our home, or the view from our home in Phoenix, New York. There's the Oswego River, the old waterway. This is March. And I always thought March was spring, but we know that's not the case in Syracuse. And one of my remembrances when I wrote to my colleagues said, yeah, Marie, someone wrote, we remember you were so excited when you realized there was a device, a de-icing device, a spray you could put in when your car locks froze, you know, the door lock. The first time my door froze, I couldn't get into my car. It was a long ordeal. I tried everything. Someone said, you get this de-icer, and I got it, but then stupidly left it in my glove compartment, which doesn't help you at all. And so learning about snow and winter and the dramatic changes of scenery, that is very much a part of my Syracuse experience. And I dare say it was a part of many of my fellow graduate students, especially those who came from tropical countries. I remember Deborah Callender, who is from Barbados. She looked out the window and she goes, what is that falling from the sky the first time it snowed? She'd never seen snow. And obviously she got to learn a lot about that. So the days were long. I spent a lot of time reading. We didn't have a TV. It was a very productive period of my life, and not to be an environmental determinist, but weather certainly helped. So these are some of the questions I asked my cohort. I asked an equal number of men and women, international and domestic. And one of the things that came up, and this was from referring to technology, one of my cohorts said, I came from Korea, which had the highest technology and a lot of faculty. SU Geography had few faculty, but the ranking was quite high. And he said, I learned from that you don't need state-of-the-art equipment to do quality work. So there was not the high-tech big computer rooms. In fact, computers were around, but they weren't ubiquitous. Faculty wrote books, and there was certainly a really high level of scholarly engagement. We were encouraged to seek grants, especially funding from various government agencies. Many of us were able to get grants, and I certainly was fortunate so that I didn't really have to TA when I was here. But then I became alarmed that I didn't know how to teach. So in my last semester here, I asked David Robinson if I could teach Latin American geography. And he allowed me and another graduate student to teach this class. And he would sit in the back and take notes and occasionally go and write things up on the board. And it was a great experience to actually have an experience of teaching a course on TAing. And I was very grateful to have those notes a couple of years later when I was assigned to teach a Latin American geography course. One thing that came up over and over again in my recollections, and certainly those of my cohort, was that we were encouraged to go into other fields and take classes in other departments. If you worked with Don Meinig, you had to take a class in the history department, and people did, and we learned a great deal from that. There was cross-pollination with anthropology, philosophy, planning, history. Some even went to the SUNY ES, Environmental Science and Forestry. And that was really important. And for the students from the UK, I think that was especially unique, because there the tendency is to just study in one discipline and to be able to move around and learn from each other. That's something that they appreciated. On one level, I think it's fair to say there was a low-tech approach to our training, but I learned a lot of techniques when I was here that I've relied upon throughout my career. One is learning about archival work and working in the archives and what you can get from doing that. And my dissertation was largely based on regional archives in the Venezuelan Andes. Especially from David, he instilled that passion for demography and population work. And now most people think about me as a scholar of migration. And I had beginnings of that and development of that while I was here. And then a fascination and love of landscape became something that geographers care about. But it was taken as a very serious research effort here, from appreciating the physical human environment of central New York to people doing landscape work and analysis like Jim Duncan using archival materials and field work in other parts of the world. And then theory was extremely important for our cohort, and especially critical social theory and postmodernism was so prevalent that you couldn't give a talk without giving a postmodern perspective by the time I was finishing up. And I got to say, my inclination as a scholar is I'm a very empirical person. I need to gather data from either the archives, talking to people, going to places, measuring. And it's often from that observation and empirical work that then I look for a theoretical understanding that will help me make sense of what I've seen. Whereas I had other members of my cohort that were really, it was theory first, and then try and find the data that will drive the research. But my reluctance to really fully embrace critical social theory, one of my faculty pulled me aside, who's no longer here, and he said, Marie, if you don't get your critical social theory together, the only place for you is going to be an all-girls school in southern Mississippi. And you can unpack that on so many levels. Incidentally, that person did not get tenure, but that was an attitude. If you didn't embrace a party line of certain ideological framework, that you were going to not matter, your work would not, and that wasn't everyone's view, obviously. But when you're a graduate student and the whole hierarchy of power, when one of your professors tells you you are off into the wilderness, you take a deep breath and think, oh my goodness, I'm maybe not cut out for this. At the same time, I heard other messages too. Obviously faculty don't all agree, And one message that I heard often, and this was from Don Meinig, is do your work, make it good work, and your work will endure. And that was often very empowering. You know, if you could feel what you were doing was of value, people were reading it, then keep on at it. I share that with you as well. I was thinking, and I actually went through my notes and seminars about postmodernism, and it's a little passé today, and yet it's not. This whole era we're in right now, the post-truth world, I would say Donald Trump is our first truly postmodern president. That it is all about however you want the world to be. You create the context, you create the facts, you create the data. And I think when we were embracing postmodernism in the 80s, it was this exciting thing of like, wow, you can deconstruct texts and think about, you know, what was the perspective of the individual based on their race or class or privilege, how they framed the research, thinking about knowledge as constructed, and I've made many arguments about that, and you know, knowledge is constructed in a way, but also this postmodernism in its full blossom can just lead to this complete relativism. Whatever fact you want to believe is the fact. And unfortunately, I think that is really in our public discourse right now and is a source of great concern. So the thing that generated a lot of excitement is, what did you remember? You know, what was an experience you had as a student, a course or activity? Friday colloquia. They were a little different back in those days. We met in the seminar room in H.B. Krause, and the graduate students were tasked to buy the snacks and the alcohol for after the colloquium. And the snacks would be very interesting because you never knew what country the colloquium committee would come, and so there would often be a weird assortment, you know, Cheese Whiz and cucumbers. I mean, you just never know what was going to be served, but there was always beer. And why the colloquium were important was that really fantastic people came to speak. Oftentimes, whether it was R.J. Johnson or David Harvey or Mona Domash. And then there was often a bit of a blood sport in the Q&A afterwards. And then you really saw faculty sometimes take people on, and it could get intense. But you learned a lot from that experience. And we met people, and sometimes we took there was enough money that graduate students could take the speaker out to the varsity and have pizza and, you know, get to know people. The seminars, I'm sure you have them still, and they were really memorable. Most of the graduate students, the work they did was in their coursework and also as TAs or RAs. Today, the graduate students I have often are working full-time jobs, and so I don't think there's that same intensity of being able to prepare. And so people came into seminars, they'd read things, they were ready to debate things. We learned from each other as much as we learned from our faculty. One of my colleagues wrote, I took Don Meinig's last historical geography seminar. It had only 4 students. They had become afraid of the workload in Don's classes. I never worked so hard, but I never learned so much, reading a book a week. And if you were not prepared, you got the stare down. That's it. You got it. But it was a tough stare, and believe me, I got it a few times, so it humbled you. Those environments were really make or break moments. The one seminar that was really important was Jim Duncan and John Agnew organized a colloquium that was tied to what would become a book project, The Power of Place. And so in that, there was a colloquium every other week or something, and people came in, and we heard some wonderful presenters. And then a year or two later, a book came out. So again, the symposium became vehicles to really foster research, which I think was important. And David also did this with the Migration Colonial Spanish America, not so much a colloquium, but workshops. And in that environment, I met a number of colleagues like Ida Samudia, who helped me in Venezuela, and George Lovell, who have all gone on and helped me in my career understanding Latin American migration, both historical and contemporary. And then a really important methodology was the road trip. I hope you're still doing road trips. It happened many different ways. My first semester, Don Meinig put Dipna McLaughlin, Richard Shine, and I in his Volvo, and we drove up to Queens, Ontario for the Eastern Historical Geography Conference. I don't even think that group exists anymore. And in the way we're driving and talking about landscape, and then we crossed the border, and he's like, okay, what changed? And we were all discussing this. It was like a rolling seminar. There were tours of Syracuse. There were just to get a break, getting out and about on the roadside. So the interesting thing about the road trip, often very informal in this area, but also abroad, is that it broke down barriers. So you got to know one another more as people, not as strictly faculty and students. So I had a few faculty road trips pictures. This is none other than David Robinson in Costa Rica. That one I had to get out of the deep archives where he was pointing out something. And, this was, I remember, after completing my comps, and that is a trauma all in and of itself. I don't know if you still do it. It's that week of writing, and you're up all night, and then you deliver the comps, and the next week you defend them. And I think maybe it was after defense, right? We went out up into the lakes and we're driving around and just enjoying the sunshine and the beauty that is central New York. I talked to my cohort, and he remarked about not even taking others around, chauffeuring folks like Amos Rappaport, Peter Hall, Milton Newton, in upstate New York countryside, and sometimes along with Meinig and Sofer. So those kind of informal interactions, really valuable. And in my department today, we still have opportunities where students get in the car or the van and we go off and do things. And that builds esprit de corps both with graduate students and undergraduates. And then there were parties. Again, there wasn't much to do, so you had to make your own fun. This was a costume party, and for some reason, it was one of the ones I have Polaroids. And one student's remembrance of kind of what was it, the unshoveled sidewalks, the parties, Grace Jones and the Talking Heads crammed into hotel rooms. I mean, there was a lot of fun to be had. And David leading the charge with usually interesting liquor that he got in Peru. So this particular comment, I think, was very important. What would you have changed? And it gets to the meat of the matter. And then people had very strong feelings about this. And one of the themes that came up is like, we wish we learned more about the business of academia, how the birds and the bees discussion about what's in store for us. And really, we learn more by osmosis. You watched your faculty. You kind of learned what were their work habits, what were they writing and printing. And a number of my cohorts said, well, yeah, if there was a class in that, I probably would have resented it enormously. I wouldn't want to have taken it. But then as you leave the protection of graduate school and get your first job, as one colleague said, I didn't even know what startup funds were, and I mean, you probably all know that now, but it was a lot looser then. You got a job and you just took it, whatever they offered, and the whole grant writing business, we would apply for funding, but the more the challenges of writing NSF grants, we probably could have been a little stronger in that. It did come up over and over again that it was not a very diverse faculty. And that certainly changed. But it was an all-male show back then. And to be fair, I received excellent mentoring. I received a lot of support from my faculty, and I wouldn't be the professional I am today. But there was always that nagging feeling, at least the women in the department felt, would there really be a place for us? Because we didn't really see any role models of women in academia. And I went through my entire undergraduate and graduate career with never having a woman professor. That would not happen today. But it certainly was not that uncommon in the 80s. And in that context were probably some theoretical blind spots. While we had robust discussions about postmodernism and structuralism, not any discussion of feminism and feminist thinking, which certainly existed in the 80s. No, because Nancy didn't teach when I was here. She had an affiliation, maybe when she started teaching. That was a blind spot, for sure. And I do think there was a sort of sink or swim attitude. You know, you made it, but there were a lot of people, and I think back, and I especially look at the pictures, where are they now that didn't? And maybe that's inevitable in a doctoral program, but as one of my colleagues said, we could have probably been a little better at the care and feeding of students and making sure that people got what they needed, not, you know, coddling them, but, you know, sometimes there would be real challenges and people just didn't come back, and that was that. And then, amazingly, because most of my cohort weren't that technically inclined, that the regrets, although partly in the 80s, GIS was just getting going, and we weren't doing GIS here. But by the 90s, it was everywhere. And if you didn't, and now, I mean, geospatial techniques, whether you're working with satellite imagery or open source data, you just got to know that stuff. And it might not be the focus of your work, but we wouldn't let a single graduate student graduate from our department without taking courses in a course or two in GIS, just to have that skill set that's expected of people coming up through a graduate program. So those were sort of the themes that came out. Again, there was reflections over time, and certainly many, many positive feelings. And I'll just put these quotes up from 3 different members of the cohort, all of which are academics today, and really very glowing views about their experience here. One was that the congeniality really meant a lot, the camaraderie of students with each other and with faculty and students. The other idea was that we were given a choice to go in the direction we wanted to. There was a lot of freedom there. So I think there's a model in many graduate programs is you just join the mill, and you get on the grant and you do what you're told. And actually you finish, you might not even really understand what you did, but you processed a lot of data. There was a lot of intellectual freedom here, and that I valued, as did others. And then just that eclecticism, there's no necessarily one approach to go, has led us all into changing with the times, adapting to new projects. So I would give overall A for experience. So I wanted to just reflect, taking off my graduate student hat and putting on my professor hat, because I've been a professor at GW for 27 years. I have a little bit of perspective. I've been a professor a lot longer than I was a graduate student, thank God. So where's graduate training today? And this is I'd love to have a dialogue with you about this. I think we're a lot more technically oriented as a discipline. Maybe some departments almost exclusively so. And geospatial techniques are extremely important in how we ask questions about space and inequality and environmental change. I also believe that the opportunities for academic geographers are more limited today. I don't see the pie in the academy getting bigger per se. And when I was a graduate student, the implicit message was a successful student was one who became an academic. And a failed student was one who didn't. And that is not a message that should fly anymore. We have to think about how we train students to do work in the world and not just in academia. And I have been privileged, I guess, where my purchase in Washington, a lot of my graduate students, we don't have a PhD program, it's a master's program, have gone on and had really influential careers at the World Bank or the Department of State or Census or government agencies or NGOs. And that cohort should be as much of our success as an academic cohort. And if you're going to be smart about attracting people to the discipline of geography, there have to be other avenues. And in fact, there are other avenues. One of the things I'm going to, hopefully this will work. Maybe it won't. I have a link to my other hat I wear is I'm the president of the American Geographical Society. And one innovation we've had in training graduate students, I was going to showcase, and I can send you the link, is partnering with NGOs as a kind of intern-client relationship. And in this case, this March, 2 of our graduate students formed a partnership with the Pan American Development Fund and said, we want to do a project with you. What do you need done? And there was a long exchange. And the conclusion was they had a grant that was concerned about preparedness for disasters. And in a country like Guatemala, disasters happen all the time, especially landslides and earthquakes. And where the PADF was working were in marginal urban areas, the classic kind of shanty towns that are the perimeters of all Latin American cities. And if you go onto Google Map, these places are usually blank. They're just, maybe there's a road. But if you go into open source platforms like OSM, you can trace these, and people do trace them. And they become networks and roads. So what we did, and this was a great collaboration on many scales, first we had a mapathon in our department, which was fueled by pizza. We got 20 students together, and they started to trace these peripheral neighborhoods where we were going to work. And then we took those tracings and went, and because PADF had its partnership with one particular community, Ciudad Satélite, we could work with the locals and say, this is the map we have. Can you help us make this better? And we spent a week with them mapping. We also did surveys. They helped modify the survey. And it was really cool walking around with 50 and 60-year-old women who were talking about the boundaries of this property and really liked the technology. Then we put all that into the map, printed it out again, and had a meeting with them talking about it. And basically, now in OSM, they're on the map. And if there is an emergency, people know how to serve this community and reach there. And it was empowering for them. It was empowering for our students. Certainly helped PADF with their grant. And then we didn't just stop at the community. We actually went and talked to the Guatemalan version of FEMA about this technology and how you could use it. They were a little, weren't so keen on it. But there'll probably be change eventually. And then meant to talk to 2 universities and say, hey, this is what we did. And we actually ran a simulation, had students map the university. We even got a drone involved. It was pretty cool. And that was a very different kind of research project than the model that I had, is you go off on your own, you make contacts, you do your research, you come back, you write it up, all great training. This involves collaboration on many levels internationally with an organization, but to do what we did in a week, we needed all those collaborations. And I think that model of a sort of capstone and engaged geography where you're actually doing a product for people and teaching skills is highly rewarding. And I'm sure for my students, they'll get a lot out of it and it will help them professionally. The other thing that I'm very conscious of is that geography has made huge progress as being almost gender balanced, which is great. But we still are a very white discipline. We, for whatever reason, have not, African Americans and Latinos have not found the way we study the world, the way we look at the world appealing. And I'm not sure why that is. But if you look at the demographic breakdown of departments, there are not many that are really diverse. And it's something that we have to, I think about in graduate programs, especially as the global demographics, the US demographics are certainly changing. And you know, yes, graduate programs today thrive because we get a lot of international students, but I think we need to think about how we're reaching out to other groups. And then I believe there's still an incredible importance in both the empirical and field traditions in geography. It's harder to fund field work, I granted that. But oftentimes, field work was funded on pretty cheaply here at SU. When I went to Belize, I said, David, I have this idea. There was this grant. I think the whole project was done for $1,000, if that, and half of that went to airfare. I was pretty frugal, and I reminisce, I found when I was doing fieldwork, I had some questions, and of course you couldn't call because that would have blown the budget. So I wrote David a letter, and the return address was P.O. Box, Belize City. David got the letter, that really thin, oniony paper. Do you even know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay. Then 2 or 3 weeks later, I go back to the P.O. box, and there's a letter from David Robinson giving me advice on what the question I had. And that kind of, we didn't have instantaneous communication, but you managed on your own. I still think geography has this incredible value in our holistic approach, and that we do engage real people and real places. If we lose that and only sit in front of screens, I think we're in danger. And then the other thing that is so obvious, it shouldn't be stated, but I think there's some geographers that are reluctant to visualize their data, to make a map, to use the power of cartography. And I worked as a resident scholar at the Migration Policy Institute in 2006. And at that time, they made very few maps. And I said, guys, migration is so mappable. Get with the program. And I worked with them, and we did. The map they did, total like Geography 101, where are Mexicans in the US? That got downloaded like 100,000 times, you know. Some things that we think is so simple, pedestrian, we shouldn't even bother, the world looks at and says, wow, you know. So you have to visualize. We're in a very visual age, and so don't give up the power of the map to inform people, to educate people. And then lastly, I'll put in a plug for my other hat. My work is in the American Geographical Society. If you haven't checked out the AGS recently, I know there's a few members of the room, and Mark Monnier just joined the council. We're happy to have him. We took the old Focus on Geography, which was a paper magazine, and it's all digital. You can Google it, one word, Focus on Geography, it comes up. It has these very cool graphics, interactive, innovative way of storytelling. We are doing this whole effort of making geography not just the value of learning where things are in the world, but geography can be a service discipline. And so through volunteer geographic information and open source mapping, we're training high school teachers who are training high school students to do this work. And Wouldn't that be cool if, they're 17, 18-year-olds, they're digital natives, they love the screens, they can do a lot of interesting humanitarian work in times of crises or just learning where things are. And also, in our work with AGS, I don't know if you all are aware of this, but 2000 was the first year that the AP Human Geography exam was given. Anyone in this room take the AP Human Geography exam? Not at all. Okay, you know what it is, right? The vision then would be wildly successful if 6,000 students took the exam. This year, 220,000 students, 220,000 high school students are taking AP Human Geography exam. That means more are taking the class. That means we do have freshmen who are coming into college who know geography. We should be there for them. They want to learn. They've taken human geography. It's now definitely in the top 10, and next year they're predicting will be number 6. It's the number 1 fastest growing AP exam. So for many years, geographers have had this inferiority complex. Nobody listens or cares about us. And people want to know this stuff. Maybe we just have to figure out a better way to present it and engage communities that we're not always comfortable in engaging. So my work in the AGS has really been to try to bring together communities of people that don't always talk to each other in government and business and academia. And it's been extremely rewarding, challenging. Those aren't always easy conversations, but really fruitful to have if you believe, as I do, that a geographically informed research and science can really have positive impacts, not just for knowing where you are in the world and how you got there, but impacts on policy and addressing critical issues like inequality. And with that, I thank you.
So please, questions, comments?
Not a one. My goodness. Yes?
You never got to it. Why did you live in Phoenix?
I forgot that. So when my husband got hired by the Syracuse newspapers, he was in the Oswego district. And back then, the Syracuse newspapers was a huge outfit. It's much smaller. Do they even publish? I think they only print the paper a few days a week now? 3 days a week, right. So he was the staff photographer in Oswego. It was if you look at the map, the first town you hit in Oswego County is Phoenix. So it was strategic. We got our place there, and he circulated all through the county, and I went south to my home in H.P. Krause. That's why I lived in Phoenix. John?
Can you tell us a little bit about the bug button?
Oh, my God. So this is before, actually, there's a connection with Rob. I started out at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and that's where I met my husband, Rob. And he was working for the AP, and one day they sent him out to Wasco County, Oregon, to take pictures of this guru named the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He was a phenomenon in Oregon. He wore all white. All his followers were red and purple, and they had this dynamic meditation that was like, what do they call that? What do they call that when people take drugs and dance? There's a term for it. Fun, yeah. Rave. It was like a rave. That's what I was thinking of. Anyhow, this is a ranching country. It's very conservative. And then this Bhagwan came in, and he had this huge festival, and like 50,000 of his followers showed up in these red robes. And the Bhagwan also had a penchant for Rolls Royces. He owned 57 of them. And every day he'd drive around in his Rolls Royce, and his followers would stand there and pray and throw rose petals. It was phenomenal. So my husband came back, and you won't believe what I just saw. And I couldn't believe it. And so then I said, let's go check it out, And so I did, and I thought, this is really interesting. My family, of course, was convinced I was going to become a Rajneeshi, but that's not the way I roll, although I do like purple. I linked it to the whole utopian movements. I mean, they had this vision of they were going to remake society into this sustainable, organic nirvana. And I don't know, within 3 years, the whole house of cards came down. The head honcho was arrested. They did this plan. They were poisoning the water in the Dalles. It fell badly, as often these things do. But so when I came here, my first publication was in the Syracuse Department of Geography discussion paper series. I took this thesis I wrote as a senior at Berkeley and published it there. I don't know if you still have the discussion paper series. No. And they're actually they have them at the Library of Congress. I've seen it there. So it did get logged on. So that's the Rajneeshis. So that's the end of my experience with cults. Yes?
So you mentioned that the gender balance is much more equal these days, but you still hear about, women doing all the emotional labor in departments and that kind of stuff, and you get worse evaluations just because they're women. Do you think, despite those facts, that it is qualitatively better for female grad students or female professors than it was in the 80s?
I do. The academy's changing. I mean, there's still inequalities. And if you look at, they dig down and sort of, average pay of male versus female professors in the same rank, there's still disparities. But there are also women administrators, and I've had a very engaged career at my university and have been able to be influential in key committees, and it's real. The teaching thing, how the humans hear male voices and female voices, but there are plenty of women I know get really good teaching evaluations and poor ones, and vice versa. So there are challenges. The biggest challenge is its core, a kind of biological one, in that a lot of times when women, if they're going to have children, it's right around the time of tenure, and it often became a choice. If you were going to have children, you couldn't be an academic. That's sort of the message, and that message is not there anymore. I mean, when I had my first child before I had tenure, and there was no leave policy. And I told my chair that my son was born in April. And I told my chair, I think I'm going to need a leave in the spring. You can't just phone it in. And he worked in Africa, and he said, women in Africa give birth and are working the next day. And I said, and they're dead at 45. What do you want? And so there was no policy. And I actually went over his head and went to the dean and said, look, I'm doing good work. I'm having a baby. That's not a crime. Could you give me a leave? And I got one. But now we have a formal policy. We actually have a paternity policy. So male faculty and female faculty can get a leave when they have children. So that way, I think progress has been made. One of my colleagues, when we wrote about this, what did it mean for you to not really have those role models? I think it made us all a lot tougher. We just decided we were going to do it, and we did. And a lot of my best friends are professors of geography from my days at Syracuse University. Does it sound familiar? Has it changed that much? Still learning through osmosis, yeah. Which works to some extent, but maybe some more explicit guidance is not a bad idea.
Which is, I think that's kind of an unfair statement too, because we have FPP and we have the one credit credit courses. I mean, there's a lot actually that we do around professionalization in the department now to get specifically at those things. And grant writing is one of those, and publishing is one of those. So we do workshops and we have those things. So I disagree that you're just left on your
I
own.
think it's one of those things where you don't know you have the questions till you start asking them.
I agree. I mean, you think, oh, I know that. And then when you really are faced with how do you do this grant? And hopefully, the one thing I learned, it took me a while to learn this, is don't be afraid to ask questions. If you don't know how to do something, find someone who can help you. And that's always embarrassing because you're worried as a graduate student, they'll make me look dumb or ill-prepared. Ask for help, and ask for it early, not at 4:47 when the grant's due at 5 p.m. And invariably, that makes a big difference.
Excellent. Well, if there are no further questions, at least formally, I invite you all to join us in a reception in Eggers 155. Thank you very much.